philosophers. This is an overview of ethics, just a brief overview to help you understand ethical terms and theories in the field. All right, so when we write or try to regulate our own or other people's behavior, we have certain mechanisms that we use to do that. One of those are laws. Laws usually address an area that is considered vital to the functioning of society, and it has penal sanctions or punishment attached to it. So sometimes people commit a wrong against society, which is minor, a misdemeanor, sometimes it's serious. But we have these because we recognize there needs to be some kind of order and understanding of how society functions. So violence, murder, theft, robbery are not allowed for obvious reasons. Then we also have rules of morality. Rules of morality are not quite as stringent as laws, depending on the circumstances. These are areas of concern to us, and they usually involve different kinds of sanctions as opposed to fines or imprisonment. They're sanctions of reputation or honor. Okay, so just an example, the whole Varsity Blues college scandal with Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin. They obviously committed some crimes there, and they got punished for them. But the probably more serious consequences they'll face is the damage to their reputation and honor, as they're not going to be associated with manipulating the system to get their kids into a college that they really didn't deserve to get into. And then we have minor areas, which are not inconsequential, but these are matters of etiquette. So how do we talk to some people? An example that's come up with me is people email me. I had a student over the summer who emailed me who was going to be in my AP Euro class. He didn't really introduce himself with his email, like, here's who I am, and address me by my name. I'm not offended by that, but there's a certain etiquette when you're just introducing yourself to somebody and you haven't talked to them before to maybe address them by their name and say your name. So, not a great way to start. Obviously, you can recover from this because it's not as serious as the other two areas. So a couple of ethical questions is, why is the society, if at all, do we need a moral code? Do we need some kind of common sense of morality? For example, it's stated in our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. So obviously that's come to include African Americans, other ethnic minorities in the 20th century with the vote and feminist movement. It's come to include women. So some would argue that that is a moral code in a sense, as we treat all people, we treat equals equally, all right? And so maybe that kind of answers its own question. But that is a big question, because not every society has the same sense of morality. Some societies are more based on, let's say, Sharia law in an Islamic country, traditional China and Japan, Confucianism. So these illustrate why civilizations and cultures think it's important to have some kind of a generally agreed moral code. And this is the more existential question. Why should I personally act or not act according to a set of ethical principles? So you could view your life as a set of just independent, individual, prudential decisions, like I'm going to do this, I'm going to do X, or I'm going to behave in a certain way because it accomplishes some objective that I have. It increases my pleasure. You could argue that in itself might be an ethical system. But it's not very reflective. So the idea here is to be reflective and think about what's the principles that are behind my actions. Can I organize my actions around a principle and lead a life that's more directed and, hence many would say more ethical. Okay, so what is ethics? Ethics addresses moral facts, terms, and judgments. We of course make judgments when we engage with morality, and we use moral terms to do that. We say that was right, that was wrong. We say, maybe we don't use this exact word, but we say you ought to do that. You're obligated to do that. You make a promise, you should keep it. You said you were going to meet your friend for a cup of coffee, you should do it. You told your parents you were going to be home by midnight, you should be home by midnight. You may have excuses and whatever, but at least you're navigating a system of language which presupposes that there are moral terms to judge things. And, when we look at a situation, there can be non-moral facts. These are usually just physical facts, just descriptors. Things like who, what, when, where, why, height, weight, color, mass, all those sorts of things. But in many cases, the moral judgments or moral facts supervene on, which means they lay over the non-moral facts. Okay, like the example here about the situation of your car versus who's driving the car under what circumstances. So the purpose of ethics is to clarify important concepts. So in the debate, for example, over physician-assisted suicide, whether people should be legally allowed to, under the guidance of a doctor, end their lives. Both those who are for and against it would use the concept of dignity. Say it's undignified to be in a hospital bed with all kinds of tubes stuck in and out of your body at great expense, instead of being at home with your loved ones and you're suffering from a debilitating terminal disease. You should be able to act in a dignified way and end your life. Those who oppose this, practice would also probably use the same phrase. It's like human beings inherently have worth and dignity, and they don't lose that just because their mental or physical state is compromised. So when we do ethical reasoning, we got to dig into the concept, what does dignity really mean, and what's the best way to conceive of it. We also use it to evaluate claims. Okay, so if somebody says, I need to be autonomous, so I should be able to end my own life. My life is a little bit like a piece of property. So I can do as I please with my car. I can do as I please with my record collection or my house. I can sell it. I can buy it. I can destroy it if I want to. So the question is that same level of autonomy apply to my life? Is my life something like a piece of property? Or, if you're an opponent of that, you would say the reason you have autonomy is because you're a rational being with a rational will, and you can't destroy that rational will in the name of honoring it. So you actually destroy the basis of morality. So these are just the kind of competing claims that argue around this concept of autonomy on a question like physician-assisted suicide. We also want to be able to evaluate basic moral assumptions. So some people that come from a religious background would say, well, it's God's law. And so then we'd have to ask, which law? Are we talking about a scripture? What about competing claims from different religions? When we say the freedom to choose, let's say in the question of abortion, is that the same kind of freedom to choose as, let's say, what you would choose when you go to the grocery store and you choose what cereals or other products? Is there a different kind of moral calculus that's involved in that kind of language? So people often use words because they're appealing. It's called rhetoric. But the idea of ethics and other philosophical branches is to dig down into that and see what some of the implications are. If we actually adopted this phrase or this concept, what would follow from that? It's a very Socratic way of thinking. All right, so there are different branches of ethics. One of those is anthropology, which is just descriptions of how cultures behave. Usually anthropologists investigate not prehistorical, but pre-industrial civilizations, tribal civilizations, and see how they create systems of norms and conventions. But it's not really to make a judgment about them, it's just to say, here's what's out there. And then meta-ethics is basically some of what I've already done, which is to investigate what is meant by terms like good and right or wrong and ought and should. What do we really mean by that? Can you see the goodness within, let's say, a beautiful painting of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel? Can you see the goodness in an action of altruism where, let's say, a person, an older person, an adult, helps or saves or rescues a child? Is the goodness within the action, or is the goodness within my evaluation of the action, which is very different because that's the subjective stance. And then we have normative ethics, which is probably what most people have in mind, is where we investigate case studies. We look at a scenario and we say, okay, given the scenario, let's say there's conjoined twins and their life expectancy is low, but if we separate the twins and give one of the twins more of the vital organs than the other, that one will have an 85% chance of survival. However, that would reduce the survival rate of the other twin down to 10 or 15%, which it wouldn't be otherwise. Is this justified? And this is not just a hypothetical scenario. There are actual boards of ethics in hospitals to deal with these kind of bioethical issues. And then we have moral psychology, which is how we actually make moral decisions. It doesn't judge whether those are right or wrong, just like what goes on in the brain or the thinking process. I'm going to introduce one of those in just a minute called the trolley problems. And then moralizing is just like you debating with your friend about whatever, capital punishment, abortion, climate change, and trying to convince them to adopt your viewpoint. All right, so these are just some branches of moral theory. So moral theory is usually divided into different kinds of philosophies, like what's called a theory of right conduct. So Kantianism, for example, which we'll talk about later, is a moral theory which focuses on right conduct. There's a moral law, and to follow the moral law means you're acting rightly, and to ignore the moral law and its dictates means you're acting wrongly. Theories of value say there's something of worth within the situation. So utilitarianism is a moral theory of value because it says that pleasure is to be preferred over pain. So the action that produces pleasure and the one that reduces pain is the better one. So then we divide that even between non-moral value and moral value. So non-moral value would be a judgment about something that's not moral, usually an object or a situation. So to say, this particular movie, this Christopher Nolan movie, is really good. I'm going to give you an account of why it's one of the best movies ever made. Somebody might disagree with that. This is not a moral claim of value. It's a non-moral claim of value. You're arguing about value, which is called axiology, but it's not a moral value. Moral value is usually engaging in what humans do. So do we attribute worth to human actions or situations produced by humans? Are they good or bad? Okay, so some fancy terms. Moral categories, and deontic just means related to duty. So the most famous deontic ethical theory is Kantianism. It basically just says there are certain obligations that you have, or duties. You might think of this in terms of profession. So I have certain obligations as a teacher to act a certain way toward my students, to fulfill my professional responsibilities. Doctors certainly have that toward their patients. Attorneys have it related to their clients. And so when we engage in this kind of behavior, there's certain things that we have to do. Those are obligatory. Certain things we're forbidden from doing, like revealing a client's confidential testimony, or optional things that we can do. Like if I'm an attorney, I can choose different strategies about how to present the case. That's not necessarily a moral concern. So, and I kind of talked about this before, there's certain kind of values that make things good and bad. We think of some things as being intrinsically valued. In other words, we do them or we engage in them or we think about them not because they're a means to an end, because they're valuable in and of themselves. We think of life this way. Think of happiness or pleasure. Like, why do you want to be happy? Well, it's kind of a nonsensical question, because it's better than being sad or unhappy. It's not necessarily happiness is good for something else. It's just good in and of itself, which is different than, let's say, money. So, yeah, you got a $10 bill or whatever, and you hand it over. So the money itself is just a piece of paper. Of course, there's the authority of the government behind it that gives it value, but it's not something you want necessarily in and of itself, unless you're a miser and you just like to roll around on your money. It's because it provides you with certain kinds of experiences or objects. So some things are intrinsically good, some things are intrinsically neutral, and some things may be intrinsically bad. Some people would disagree and think that good or bad is something that's completely relative to the person or the culture. So moral value and moral worth, usually we say, requires an agent or a person acting, as I said before. So the goal of moral theory is to give us a decision procedure for making moral decisions. Not necessarily like a scientific formula, but a series of steps that we might follow. It also helps clarify what makes something right or wrong. So what makes something water isn't the fact that it has some kind of external appearance to it. It's because it has the chemical structure H2O. There might be other things that appear to be like water, but they're not water unless they have H2O. And there might be some actions which might be considered right or wrong only if they have certain kinds of characteristics, regardless of the other facts about them. And, we may want to create some set of moral principles or an argument that connects a theory with a certain way of approaching our decisions about life. Some philosophers deny that there's anything like principles, ethical principles, that every situation is completely independent and by itself. You may choose to live by the general principle, like I'm going to be honest, okay? For a variety of different reasons. There doesn't just have to be one. And then this is what philosophy does in general, but we hope that when you follow an ethical or philosophical path, is that you are not just doing it on a case-by-case basis, that you're deeply reflective, you're looking for the unifying principles and ideas that support your not just decisions, but your entire life of ethics or character. And so it unifies your life around this core set of beliefs. And some would argue, especially virtue ethics and ancient thinkers, this is the best way to live, is to have a unifying morality that guides your decision making. It also makes life more efficient, because then you don't have to agonize between two decisions in every case, because you have a set of principles that tell you exactly what to do. So when we evaluate theories, we of course want theories that are consistent. We don't want them to yield completely contradictory results in very similar circumstances. We want them to be determinate. We want them to give us a clear understanding of certain concepts, like what does dignity actually mean? We don't want a theory that's dependent on three ambivalent meanings of critical terms. We want it to be intuitively appealing. We don't want a theory that tells us, you should do this, you should torture innocent babies, and we say, well, okay, maybe the decision theory yields that result, but that doesn't seem intuitively like something I should do. It should also have internal support, so it should correspond with some of our other beliefs. It shouldn't contradict our beliefs about politics or relationships. It should gather those together and organize them in a better way. And it should have a lot of explanatory power. It should explain not just ethics as one separate, independent area of life, but our entire life as a whole should be unified together around a set of principles. And hopefully it has external support from other disciplines, okay? So we wouldn't want our ethical theory of, let's say we have a certain conception of happiness, to be contradicted by every psychological study. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Or that contradicts the basic principles of maybe every theological concept across the globe that's been come up with. That would probably, be evidence on the side that maybe this isn't the best ethical theory. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to share with you, and you're probably familiar with some of this, some of you are probably familiar with this, is 3 scenarios, and I'm going to actually ask you to decide what you should do in each one of these situations. So you're the person right here at the switch, and let's imagine that there is a runaway trolley. It's, for whatever reasons, the brakes have failed. And there's a family of 5 on the tracks, and let's say these tracks are not supposed to be operational. Let's say the family was going for a walk in a nature area, and as far as they were concerned, this was closed to any kind of trolley traffic. But this trolley is, runaway trolley. And let's say in the scenario, the family of 5 here is trapped in a narrow canyon with no escape. So you're standing there watching this situation unfold. And you also notice there's a worker right here on the siding. And let's say this person has like some noise-canceling headphones on and a very loud piece of machinery like a pneumatic drill. They can't really hear anything. Let's say they have their back to you. So you only have a moment to decide. So here's the question. Should you pull the switch with the intent of saving the family of 5, knowing that in all likelihood the person on the siding, the worker, is probably going to be killed by the trolley that you've diverted down that track? Is that morally justified? Okay, that's trolley problem number 1. All right, trolley problem number 2 is a different scenario, similar idea though. So let's say, this is a kind of comical drawing, but let's say you're on a ledge. It could be, kind of a mountain ridge, and you've just met this like really obese man, and you notice the same situation unfolding, except there's no siding this time. There is a runaway trolley. There's a family of 5, and however you want to conceive of it, that's going to be clearly maimed or killed by this runaway trolley. And you're looking around, and you realize the only thing that's going to stop this train from killing the family of 5 is if I push the obese man and he's going to fall down onto the tracks. Obviously, the distances here aren't really to scale, but let's imagine that they are. And you have a pretty good idea that the trolley's not terribly large. The fat man is quite, wide, and that his body will, lodge underneath the trolley, and stop it from killing the family of 5. Of course, in the process, he will be maimed or killed in all likelihood, and you know this. But you do need to push him down in the path of the trolley. Let's say you have a pretty good chance, 90%, that he will fall directly on the tracks and, in the process, save the family of 5. So the question is, should you do that? Okay. Last scenario is what's called the transplant case. So let's imagine that you are the doctor from a very famous organ transplantation hospital, and a patient comes in who is, let's say he's in his 30s. You do his intake, and let's say he's on Medicaid because he's poor. He doesn't have any job and any money. He may even be homeless, as far as you know. And he needs a repair of his knee. Maybe he's got a torn meniscus or ACL or something like that. And so the hospitals are going to pay for it. And as you do his intake, you not only realize that he doesn't really have any family, he doesn't really have any prospects. There's hardly anybody who seems to know him. He doesn't really have any kind of social life. He's also a rare blood type that also happens to match in 5 people who are in your transplant ward, desperately waiting for an organ. And if they don't get it, as you probably know, there's a shortage of organs in the United States and in the world. They will die. But these aren't just 5 ordinary people. These are 5 extraordinary people. So let's say there's an African president who his country's been ravaged by a civil war, and he's been able to bring the rival factions together toward some kind of peace. However, he has a severe heart defect, and if he doesn't get a heart transplant, he's probably going to die soon, and that may cause this civil war in his country to revive. Let's say we have a Nobel Peace Prize winner, a beautiful person who's, and I mean internally beautiful, whose message of peace and love has helped heal the world. She's won the Nobel Peace Prize, but she has a lung condition, and the only way she's going to survive is if she gets a new set of lungs. let's say there's a cancer researcher who's on the cusp of maybe discovering a new genetic therapy which could effectively be a cure for cancer. There's still some things to be decided, but this person has, hepatic illness. They're going to die of this if they don't get a new liver. So that's their situation. And then we have each person, has 2 kidneys. And so kidney number 1 could go to a concert pianist, which is somebody who their message of folk music has inspired their country, which was newly independent, being controlled by foreign powers for centuries. And her music of peace has given hope to her country. And let's say there's an astrophysicist who's investigating the origins of the universe. And she is like unlocking the mysteries of the beginnings of the cosmos, but she also has a renal failure and needs a kidney. So the question here is, what you could do as the doctor is you could tell the patient who just came in, the itinerant man, that you will repair his ACL or repair his knee, but actually what will happen is you will give him the anesthesia, and without his consent or knowledge, you would give the 5 organs to the people who are desperately in need of them. And since the man has no family or anything, you can just claim that he died on the operating table. Nobody will probably be the wiser, and then you could try to help those 5 people, who will then help, obviously, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of other people. So the question is here is, what would you do in each one of these cases? And then this question is, and this is how utilitarianism would view it, which is maximizing utility, are these all the same cases? In other words, are they all an example of sacrificing one person for the sake of 5 lives? Do you see them as being morally and ethically the same, or do you see them as being different? So that's what I'd like you to think about right now.